There is a particular kind of silence that exists in places where people used to be. Not the silence of a forest that has never been touched. That silence is full and alive and layered with sound if you stop and listen long enough. This is a different kind of silence, heavier, more deliberate. The silence of a place that remembers noise, that remembers voices and the ring of steel on rock and the creak of timber under load, and has been waiting ever since for those sounds to come back. That is the silence we walked into today. We almost didn't make it. The trail that once led to this site, and it was a real trail once, wide enough for a loaded pack mule, graded with care by men who needed to move supplies up a steep mountain face every single day, has been gone for decades. Not just overgrown, gone. A debris slide sometime in the late 20th century took out a significant section of the approach, and what the slide didn't take, the alder did. A Pacific Coast alder grows fast and thick, and it doesn't negotiate. It just moves in and fills every available space, and within 20 years there is no evidence that anything was ever there before it. So we went cross-country, up the fall line of the slope, which is the hard way to climb a mountain, but sometimes the only way when the established routes have disappeared, through vine-maple tangles that grabbed at every piece of gear. Across a boulder field that had slid down from the ridge above at some point and was now partially revegetated, the boulders themselves covered in moss so thick it looked like green velvet, the gaps between them deep enough to swallow a leg if you weren't paying attention, and then through a band of old-growth timber, genuine old growth, its trees with circumferences that you cannot reach around even with two people, where the undergrowth thinned out, and the walking became suddenly and mercifully easier. It was in this old-growth band that we found the first sign, not an artifact, not a structure, something subtler than that, a change in the ground, a faint depression running roughly horizontal across the slope, maybe 2 feet wide, following the contour of the hillside with a regularity that nature doesn't produce. Yes, this was a trail, or what remained of one. The depression was the ghost of the original tread, pressed into the hillside by years of foot traffic and pack animal use, and even after a century of abandonment and seasonal frost heave and root action, it was still just barely readable in the landscape. We followed it. The ghost trail led us along the contour for maybe 300 yards, curving gently around a rocky outcrop and then beginning a very slight upward traverse toward a small draw, a narrow valley cut by a seasonal creek that opened up above us. And it was at the mouth of this draw where the slope eased off into a small, relatively flat area, maybe the size of half a football field, that we found the camp. We want to be careful about how we describe the first impression here, because it would be easy to oversell it and then have you feel like we overpromised. So let us be precise. The camp is not dramatically visible. You don't crest a rise and suddenly see buildings and equipment laid out before you like a movie set. What you see first is more subtle than that, and in some ways more powerful for it. You see the way the flat area is shaped, not naturally flat, but artificially flat, graded and leveled by human hands and maintained by human use over years. You see the stumps, dozens of them. The old growth trees that once stood here cut down to clear the site, the stumps now waist-high and completely covered in moss, each one a perfect little moss-covered mound that you might mistake for a boulder if you didn't look closely enough to see the flat top and the remnant of the saw cut. You see the color changes in the vegetation, the subtle shifts in what's growing, where that happened when the soil has been disturbed and amended by decades of human activity. And then, once you've absorbed all that context, you start to see the actual remains of the structures themselves. There were at least 4 buildings here, probably more. The evidence for 4 is clear and unambiguous. 4 distinct footprints in the landscape, 4 areas where the timber and the debris and the collapsed roof lines are concentrated. The others are more speculative, shapes in the undergrowth that might be structural remains or might just be the way the land falls. Hey, we're going to stick with what we can confirm. The largest structure was on the uphill side of the flat area, positioned to take advantage of the slightly higher ground, and presumably to serve as the primary bunkhouse or cook shack, or both. In operations of this scale and era, the main building often served multiple functions: sleeping quarters, eating area, and sometimes basic tool storage, all under the same roof. The footprint of this building is roughly 30 feet by 20 feet, which would have been a substantial structure for this kind of remote site. The walls are down, completely down and collapsed inward, which is typical. When the roof goes, and it always eventually goes, the walls follow it inward rather than outward, because the weight of the failing roof pushes everything down and in. What you're left with is essentially a low mound of gray-weathered timber, was a collapsed sandwich of roof boards and wall boards and floorboards and the moss and debris of a century layered over and between all of it. But the floor of this building is extraordinary. Because these miners built on a slope, they had to level the building pad, and the way they did that on the uphill side was to cut into the hillside to create a vertical back wall of earth. And on the downhill side, they built up a low foundation of stacked stone to bring the floor level up to match. And that stacked stone foundation is still there, still largely intact. Running along the downhill edge of the building footprint, maybe 18 inches to 2 feet high, hand stacked without mortar in the dry-laid tradition that miners across the Pacific Northwest used because it required no specialized materials and was enormously strong if done correctly. And the stones are local, pulled from the creek bed and the boulder field we crossed on the way in, river-rounded on one side, the other side split for a flatter bearing surface. Someone spent real time and real skill building this foundation. It was meant to last, and it has. Inside the collapsed footprint of the main building, the floor itself, or what remains of it, is also partially visible where some of the collapsed roof material has slid to one side over the years. The floorboards are Douglas fir, 2 inches thick, still basically flat despite over a century of sitting in the damp. They're dark and weathered, and shot through with the fruiting bodies of various wood decay fungi, but the basic structural integrity of the wood is surprisingly maintained in places. You can see the nail pattern, large square-cut nails, not the round wire nails that came into common use after about 1900, which gives us a useful dating reference. Square-cut nails were standard before approximately 1900. Finding them here is consistent with the 1890's date we have for this operation. The second building was smaller, maybe 15 by 15 feet, positioned about 40 feet to the southeast of the main building, separated from it by a gap that was probably used as a work area or a wood storage area. This one is more completely collapsed. The roof came down harder or earlier, and the debris pile is lower and flatter. But the outline is still clear, and around the perimeter of the collapse, you can see the remnants of the sill logs, the large diameter logs that would have formed the base of the wall framing and sat directly on the ground or on short foundation piers. These sill logs are the most durable part of any log structure because they're the densest wood in the building. The old-growth fir or cedar at the base is so resin-saturated that it resists decay far longer than the smaller dimension lumber used in the upper walls and roof. Between the two main buildings, we found the first of the camp's artifacts. It's a stove, or what remains of one, a cast-iron wood-burning camp stove. I'm the kind that was standard equipment in every mining camp and logging camp and trapper's cabin across the Pacific Northwest in the late 1800's. The stove is on its side, tipped over when the structure around it collapsed and never righted. It's heavily rusted. Cast iron in a wet climate oxidizes steadily, and after 130 years, it's fully converted to rust on the exterior. But the basic form is completely intact and recognizable. You can see the firebox door opening. You can see the top surface with the circular lid rings that allowed you to set pots directly over the fire. You can see where the stovepipe collar was, the collar itself long since gone along with the stovepipe, but the opening clear and unmistakable. This stove fed men who were doing some of the most physically demanding work available in 1890s America. It's remarkable to see it here, tipped over in the moss and the ferns, rusting quietly back into the earth. Next to the stove, half buried in the accumulated organic debris of the forest floor, we found something that we initially mistook for a large rock. The shape was wrong for a rock, though, too regular, too squared off at the corners. We cleared some of the debris away with gloved hands and found ourselves looking at a canvas sack, or what was once a canvas sack. The canvas itself is long since gone, deteriorated beyond recognition. But the contents of the sack have held their shape remarkably well inside their former container. It's nails, a large quantity of cut nails, the same square-cut style as we found in the floorboards, compacted together by rust and time into essentially a solid mass of corroded iron. Whoever left this sack of nails here expected to come back for them. They didn't. That detail, the sack of nails, is one of those things that hits differently when you're standing in the place rather than reading about it, because nails were not cheap. Nails were not something you left behind carelessly. In a remote mining camp in the 1890s, where every supply had to come up a mountain on the back of a mule, nails were a material you kept track of. You kept them dry. You kept them in a sack so you could find them. And if you left them behind, it wasn't because you forgot them. It was because you left in a hurry or under circumstances that made retrieving a sack of nails irrelevant. Something happened here. We don't know what. We probably never will. But something happened, and the nails are evidence of it. The third structure was the most structurally interesting of the four. Set slightly apart from the others, at the edge of the flat area where the ground begins to slope away toward the draw, this was almost certainly a combination powder house and tool cache. Powder houses, the small buildings used to store blasting powder or dynamite, were always built away from the main living and working area for obvious reasons. They were also often built with more substantial construction than the other camp buildings, since the consequences of structural failure were considerably more serious. This one was built into the hillside. The back wall is literally the hillside itself, a vertical cut face of earth and rock that serves as both the rear wall and an additional layer of protection. The front and side walls were timber framed, now collapsed, but the back wall of earth is permanent and still perfectly vertical. And set into this earth wall, framed by a timber lintel that has somehow survived, is a small opening, a storage niche, maybe 2 feet wide by 18 inches tall by 3 feet deep, are cut directly into the earth and shored with planks that are now rotted away, but whose presence can still be detected by the rectangular staining they left in the soil. The niche is empty now. Whatever was stored in it, and our best guess based on context, is either blasting caps or fuse material, the sensitive components that you always stored separately from the main explosive charge, was either removed when the camp was abandoned or has deteriorated completely. We're inclined toward the latter, since fuse material and percussion caps of that era were not durable enough to survive 130 years of moisture in a Pacific Northwest environment. But the niche itself, the careful construction of it, the deliberate placement, this is practical intelligence at work, the accumulated wisdom of men who knew how dangerous their materials were and took sensible precautions to manage that danger. These weren't reckless men. They were professionals operating in an environment that demanded professionalism or punished the lack of it severely. The fourth building is the one that gave us the most. It was the smallest of the four and the best preserved, which seems counterintuitive until you understand why. This building was built against a large granite outcrop on the eastern edge of the flat area, the rock face forming one full wall of the structure and protecting it from the weather that comes predominantly from the west in this drainage. The rock wall is still there, obviously, and what was attached to it, the timber framing that formed the other three walls of the building, is partially still there as well, not upright. The wall frames have leaned and sagged and partially collapsed against the rock face, but they haven't fallen completely. And in the sheltered space between the leaning walls and the rock, there is a pocket of preserved material that is genuinely astonishing. The first thing we saw was a leather strap, just a piece of leather, hanging from a nail in one of the leaning wall studs, dark and stiff and cracked, but unmistakably leather. The nail it's hanging from is a square-cut nail, driven into the stud years ago and still firmly in place. The leather strap is about 2 feet long and maybe 1.5 inches wide. It's the kind of strap that could have been part of a harness or a pack strap, or any of a dozen other things that men in a working camp needed leather straps for. But it's here. It's leather. It's 130 years old, and it's hanging on a nail exactly the way someone hung it, possibly for the last time, when this camp was still a going concern. Below the leather strap, on what was once a shelf formed by a horizontal board nailed between 2 studs and still partially intact, there were 2 bottles, glass bottles, dark green in color, with the same applied lip and pontil-marked base that we associate with pre-1900 glass manufacture. One of them is intact, completely unbroken. The other has a crack running from the lip down about 2 inches, but is otherwise whole. Both have that characteristic purple tint in the glass that develops over decades of UV exposure. Though in this sheltered spot they've probably seen less direct sunlight than the amber bottle we found at other sites, so the tint is subtler. These bottles almost certainly held some form of spirits, whiskey or brandy most likely. Keeping spirits in a remote mining camp was standard practice in the 1890s, not primarily for recreation, but because alcohol had genuine practical value as an antiseptic, a painkiller, and a cold-weather warming agent in an era before modern medical supplies were accessible in remote locations. 2 green bottles on a shelf, unchanged for 130 years. Every storm that has come through this drainage in that time, every earthquake, tremor, every season of freeze and thaw and freeze again, and the bottles are still on the shelf. It's the kind of thing that makes you stand still for a while and just look. We spent the better part of an afternoon at this site, mapping it as carefully as we could, documenting every feature, photographing everything. The light came and went as clouds moved through the drainage above us, and every time the light shifted, the site changed character completely. In the flat gray light it looked sad and abandoned. In the moments when the sun broke through the canopy, it looked almost beautiful. The gray, weathered wood and the brilliant green moss and the dark rock of the outcrop all lit up at once, the whole thing suddenly vivid and alive in a way it probably hasn't been since the last miner walked out of here. We talked a lot on the way back down about what this place was and what happened to it. The camp clearly wasn't abandoned in an orderly, planned way. The sack of nails is evidence of that, and so is the leather strap hanging on the wall and the bottles on the shelf. Planned abandonments are tidy. People take their useful things. They pack out their tools and their hardware and their personal possessions. What gets left behind in a planned abandonment is the stuff that truly isn't worth carrying. The stove, maybe, if it was too heavy, but not the nails, not the bottles. So something interrupted the orderly operation of this camp. It might have been financial, a collapse in metal prices, which happened repeatedly in the 1890s as the national economy lurched through the boom-bust cycle of the Gilded Age. It could wipe out the economics of a marginal mining operation overnight and send the men looking for work elsewhere, with no time for a careful pack-out. It might have been a dispute over the claim. Claim jumping and ownership conflicts were endemic in mining districts of this era and could shut down an operation abruptly. It might have been an accident. It might have been something we will never know about because the people who knew are long dead, and the documentary record of small remote operations like this one is fragmentary at best. What we know is what we can see, the stumps and the flat ground and the stacked stone foundation, the collapsed buildings and the tipped stove and the rusted nails, the leather strap and the green glass bottles on the shelf. These are the evidence. This is what remains of the lives of people who came out here, or into this mountain drainage more than 130 years ago and tried to pull something valuable out of the rock and build something worth having. They didn't quite make it, but they were here. And now, so were we. We'll see you on the next one.